idea is to make your work accessible to lay readers as well as the specialists who access the encyclopedia online. So I would like this interview to be as comprehensive as possible. And I thought to begin the interview, I was intrigued by one of the titles of your essay, The Honest Body. What do you mean by honest body? And then is there something called the dishonest body? And what is the relationship between a honest body and dance?
I mean, of course, there's bound to be certain subjectivity in the use of any of these terms when one talks about an honest person as opposed to a person who lies or pretends, and I think it's very much within this frame and also within the frame of what my history of dance is. So when one was looking at the early work that Chandralekha did, the work that she was doing on the form of Bharatanatyam alone, one was looking at the whole form or the way Bharatanatyam was being presented in a certain time of history as false in the sense of that wasn't what the form was about necessarily. The form had become at a certain time about sort of entertainment, about certain kind of seduction, there was a certain pretense, I think, that became a part and parcel of how the Bharatanatyam dancer was expected to be. And I think that I still do remember when I first started to work with Chandra, there was a lot of use of terminology like cheating or lying, and it was always used in terms of the people who weren't able to really look with brutal honesty at their own action, at their own physical possibilities. So it's like, okay, I can't do a complete split, but let me pretend. So there was, that's a simplistic kind of an example I'm throwing at you. But I think that for me, over years and time, it was really to look for a performer who was capable of being on a stage rather than like pretending on a stage, a person who could be devoid of certain layers of affectation, ornamentation, who was acting, a person who could just really be and be in the body. So I think that over time, I agreed with this terminology of the honest body in different ways and with different levels of perhaps brutality. It's also been what I've been looking when I work with other dancers. Some who come to me from Bharatanatyam always have so much more problem to understand this idea of just letting go of these ideas of what your body is and who you are even. So I think that these are processes, and I think these are processes to arrive at or to achieve somehow the idea of what you imagine you want a performing body to become, and how you want. And of course, the discourse was always a lot larger than just dance, especially in Chandra's work. It was always about also, that it's always how you live your life, to see it the next day in the rehearsal process. So it was a lot of, in ways it was, for some, I think, a little extreme. And as I work, with every decade, I feel dancers less able to engage this whole discourse about life and art, and so one has to adapt. Also, the idea of what the honest body could be is an adaptable idea, I think. But I think for me, it's always possible to see in a performance what the real person is and who's really being there and who's pretending to be there. I think it boils down to that somehow.
So when did you join Chandra?
So I joined the company in 1990, just after I came out of university.
What was your initial impressions of Chandra's work?
For me, it was. For me, Chandra was providing an answer somehow to everything I had questioned in Bharatanatyam before, and everything that actually took me away from Bharatanatyam and led me to study the sciences. And I hadn't been dancing for 4 years.
You were trained as a
I was
Bharatanatyam
trained
dancer.
before that. All my childhood, I trained in Bharatanatyam with Pandanallur Subarai in Pune. But never, it was never an ambition for me to perform that form, because there was always for me a sense of disagreement. But as a practice, I think that it was something that I physically did enjoy at many levels. And when I first walked into Chandra's space, they were rehearsing Shri at the time, and for me it was completely miraculous to see her. I agreed with everything she was doing at the time on so many levels, and I think most importantly for me it became a very important schooling. It filled in, Chandra always joked to us, you English educated people. And yes, I wasn't convent educated, so it wasn't that bad. But there were so many ideas of history, politics, identity, aesthetic that were just absent for us growing up in a regular CBSE school. And I think that for me with those 10 years with Chandra, it was really about that. I think I really understood such a large idea and context and who I was and even if I couldn't completely embody it, because I had of course a huge, I think, disadvantage of being predominantly English speaking, coming from a predominantly family of academics who weren't that engaged with certain discourses that were alive in those days. But I do think that that for me it was a big life shift.
Let's talk about your disagreements with the traditional Bharatanatyam. You mentioned the pretenses in the Bharatanatyam just now, and then you also not very comfortable with the narrative of the Bharatanatyam that I mentioned in many of your articles, two of your articles, and another thing is the posture, understanding of the postures, which is another thing you mentioned in your article.
Very big problems.
Yeah. What are your disagreements?
I think there are many things to be said about this. In fact, I often, please edit this out, but I often jokingly tell my dancers that they should make me a director of Kalakshetra. I would do Bharatanatyam a lot of good. No, but jokes aside, I think the first, and there's a huge problem with the way of teaching pedagogy. In a form which is traditionally passed down by the Natvanars. In fact, my teacher was a Natvanar, a supreme Natvanar, but didn't know how to dance. So all of his teaching was done with him sitting on the floor, beating the stick and telling us what to do. But there was no detail to that teaching in terms of any anatomical detail, none of that. But I'll come back to that later. So at the age of 8 years old, I performed my Arangetam when I was 12, and actually the Mohamana Varnam in Bhairavi Ragam is what I performed when I was 12 years old for my Arangetam. But it was impossible. How can you expect a 10 or 11-year-old girl to comprehend any of that, that emotionality of what that Varna means, what the heroine is doing? How can you ask a 12-year-old to look coy, to look like they're in love? There's this obvious senselessness. And I do know that people do tell me that in the later years, people are looking at more age-appropriate content. But I mean, for myself, also coming from a family where religion was not present in my life. I mean, I was never a very religious person. I found the whole idea of God difficult for me within that a certain context. It wasn't something I could believe. The content of what I was asked to represent was not something that I could be convinced about. So I think that was where, so all through sort of one's early childhood, one is acting, one is just, you know, fulfilling the obligation of a teacher somehow, but it never felt very convincing for me. And that's why I think, and there was a second thing which joins more together with the idea of the pretense. It was this whole idea of constantly smiling. And, you know, it just didn't make any sense to me. Why is somebody smiling through this performance? And as you get older, if you look at someone like the work of some of our senior dancers, it's not just smiling. There's a particular kind of smiling. Every dancer has their own style. Some are more coquettish. Some play between a kind of pretend anger and, you know, there's different levels at which the smile is enacted. And for me, these were all terrifically problematic things just to perform. And also, I never enjoyed watching it. It never made sense to me. And of course, once I grew older and I started to understand the history of where Bharatanatyam started from, and why it has turned into the form in which it exists today, I can understand it theoretically, intellectually. I see why it became what it was. And so the big relief for me when I went to work with Chandra, and when we were working on a piece like Prana, where the grammar of Bharatanatyam was so present, but you know, she was like, please don't smile, you know, like wipe that horrible mannerism off your face. So this whole business of being able to still perform and to practice everything which I loved about Bharatanatyam, which was really the nritta, the adavu, you know, the line, without having to also smile at an audience, it made a lot of sense for me. I was like, why hadn't somebody thought of this before? You know, for me it was an absolute genius of hers, actually, probably the most genius thing that she did. And of course, there was a very annoying article that, an interview she did for a newspaper where she says, I dislike the diabolic smiles of Bharatanatyam dancers, and it has really become that.
Yeah.
You know, so and also, I mean, I think that if the big difference between the practice of Abhinaya in Bharatanatyam as opposed to in a form like Kathakali or Kudiyattam is the lack of technique, quite very simply put. It's so what ends up happening is the dancer on stage is resorting to their own kind of mannerism, you know, like, and something they obviously observe from film. I don't know where they get their sources from, but there's no really technical breakdown, you know, of how many millimeters to move the eyeball, how many inches to twitch the mouth, you know, which is all remarkably prescribed in so many other forms. But somehow with Bharatanatyam, we got so much into this cult of the diva, you know, that it became very problematic for me. And to return once again, I say today there is the average Bharatanatyam dancer is completely out of touch with their own body. Has no understanding of anatomy, doesn't know where their spine begins and ends, doesn't know where their Natya Rambe begins and ends. has no sense of which muscle supports which action or which movement. And it's leading to dancers who are injured too young for what they do, and just very unthinking kind of body of people who are doing very rigorous things with their body, but it's just not it's not interesting to watch anymore. It's too raw, it's too crude. There needs to be an injection of more updated scientific knowledge. Just not that we want to change what the form is. If you want to sit in Aramandi for 2 hours and damage your knees, that's still your choice. But do it in a way that you don't damage your knees. Do it efficiently. And I think that in the way that the form has, and the teaching of the form has remained so stagnant, predominantly, I do think there are pockets. There are people like Navtej in Delhi who have been trying to inject other pedagogic strains into the teaching of Bharatanatyam, but predominantly I don't see this. And I think that when a dancer, I'm working with a dancer who finished from Kalakshetra, I mean, just it's quite shocking for me, the sort of naivety with which they actually emerge from there. And to be very honest, oftentimes they're not even good at their own practice. So, in this whole discourse about purity and preserving tradition, what are we actually talking about?
Chandra introduced other forms like Kalaripayattu and yoga into Bharatanatyam. What do you think of it at that point?
I don't see it like that at all. I mean, I find the way you articulate the question wrong.
Okay.
Sorry. So it wasn't that she injected yoga or Kalaripayattu. No. Her point was this. We want to find a contemporary practice that emerges out of Indian physical traditions, as opposed to just importing Western ideas, because Western contemporary dance had already been in existence for quite a few decades when Chandra began her own work. Her idea was, how can we look at what would we call Indian physicality?
Okay.
So, in order to understand what for her Indian physicality was, she looked at what do we have here in terms of forms. So we have yoga. In the south we have predominantly Bharatanatyam, that was where she came from. And then in her travels to Kerala, she discovered and fell in love with Kalaripayattu. And the reason I think that she used these three as the sort of the main poles of what became her own practice later was that she saw certain qualities in all of the three which were unique. So for instance, when she looked at Kalaripayattu, she saw remarkably grounded bodies that had strength which the Bharatanatyam dancer didn't have for her.
Okay.
At the same time, when she looked at yoga, she said there's an understanding about spine, there's an understanding about flow of energy within the body that Kalari doesn't perhaps have, and Bharatanatyam. So she was looking for what are the unique qualities really. I mean, I think that was the intention with which she started this whole business of cross training. That was very simply where it started. So Bharatanatyam dancers would not only learn Bharatanatyam, but they would learn yoga and Kalaripayattu in order to sort of achieve a quality that went beyond what they already had. And I think through her years of work, what she really wanted to do, which I think she finally achieved when she created Sharira, was sort of a synthesis of the body principle. Like she sort of, what she learnt from her work with the three forms separately over the years somehow came together, and she was looking to create a sort of a vocabulary, I think. And
a vocabulary of a body interacting with the time and space.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or something like that.
Absolutely.
And then,
A body that has a recognizable aesthetic starting point, a recognizable technical starting point that would be located within this.
see, for instance, in Angika and Mahakal, you see Kalaripayattu and yoga very explicitly. These are forms that are taken from Kalaripayattu, yogic postures, and then they are integrated into the dance. But then in Sharira, you don't really see that.
So I think this is what I'm talking about.
Right.
I think for any kind of artistic practice, I think it takes so many years to develop. I mean, it's the same also with any, like if you look at an academic study of science, you have a starting point, or because my background is chemistry, I know you have a starting point of this many schools of thought. It takes 10 or 15 years of research before you can come with your proposition. I think that's the kind of time that art is demanding. But what you do in those in-between times, within a performative tradition, you can't say, wait, I'm going to produce a work 15 years later. You keep producing, but the act of producing those in-between works, which are not always complete and not always what the actual intention is, but they're sort of they become the necessary stepping stone, I think. And at a certain moment, you feel you arrive, and I think that for me, the tragedy, or whether I should call it tragedy, is that, I mean, also I think what was interesting was that we must remember that Chandra began her choreographic practice, I mean, when she was quite mature already, I mean, already in her 50s. So compared to a lot of long artistic careers which span 4 or 5 decades, she had a brief one, and it took that much time to arrive at Sharira. And I think that for me, what's interesting in the looking at Chandra's work is not in the individual dissection, because I think there were a lot of unsuccessful pieces as well. But I think what's interesting for me to look at is where did it eventually lead her, and how can we regard it, that legacy over time.
Yeah, but that brings me to another question. That is, you recognize movement as the primary unit of dance in Sharira, possibly, which is not definitely indebted to any of these Bharatanatyam, Kalaripayattu or yoga, which is quite free from these forms in a way. But then the movement is well rehearsed.
Yeah.
And it is not completely free, it's not spontaneous on stage.
No, absolutely not.
And then, but I remember you quoting Chandra saying that movement makes its own meaning. It is not predetermined movement, but then how is this free meaning emerging out of the movement? If it is not spontaneous, if it is well rehearsed and then well rehearsed in advance and then repeated on stage.
What is when we use this word spontaneous, what do we mean? Do we use it in a context of saying something is just improvised or created on the spur of the moment? But why does that necessarily mean that it has more meaning than something that's rehearsed? I think that one of the most important qualities of a professional performer, a performer who has to perform the same performance 40, 50 or 200 times over years, is the ability to de-mechanize the known. While there are people who are working in the sphere of dance with improvisation, but most of the big sort of the canonic names of contemporary dance have never put improvised movement on the stage. Choreography means necessarily the precision of movement in time and space. Now, if a movement needs to get from here to here in X amount of time, of course you can give a little bit of leeway to the performer, because every day a performer's rhythm is a little bit different. So every time when I was performing Sharira, some days it was 50 minutes long, some days it was 48 minutes long. That was my rhythm of the day. So there's a certain flexibility, especially in a performance where movement and music aren't necessarily together all the time, where there's a certain freedom that to allow for each other. But let's not fool ourselves. In any performance, whether it's a Bharatanatyam performance that makes you cry because it's so emotional, or a Kathakali performance, these are extremely well rehearsed.
Yeah.
There is no improvisation.
Of course not.
But why is it that there's an expectation then when it comes to a contemporary practice? Because I hear this a lot, a feeling that anything goes in contemporary practice.
No, that's not the idea.
Okay,
And
so to come back to a specific strain of thought of movement creating meaning, I think that this is spoken in the context. Of course, it depends what we call meaning. Again, it's spoken in a context of that the movement has its own existence. That is somewhere separate from even the interpretation which the performer gives it. I do believe that. Because if you are constantly at the mercy of a performer's interpretation to give meaning to the movement, you would be in quite a lot of trouble. So, movement is an entity on its own. A performer, of course, enters this idea of performing movement. But eventually, I think that the meaning must be read predominantly from where the movement is, where the visual sense of movement takes the audience, I think. And I think that, of course, different audiences have different abilities to read movement. Some people have more references than others. Some people respond purely instinctively. Some people are still constantly looking at the blank faces of performers, wondering what to think about it all. So there are so many types of ways of viewing dance, I think that. But I think that in the context specifically of Sharira, in all of Chandra's previous works that were so conceptually led, where she necessarily went into the studio saying, this is a piece about this, and this is where my research ideas come from, this is what I want the piece to express. I think with Sharira, she really came in a very different state of mind, very much having a real sense of understanding of what her form had become over so many years. So again, I disagree with you when you say it doesn't derive so obviously from Bharatanatyam and yoga and Kalaripayattu, because for me it very obviously derives. It's just that the lines are so much more blurred, where she said, let's not worry about what we want to mean.
Yes, you were talking about movement. And you were saying even a rehearsed movement in a contemporary dance still allows room for the individual dancer to be creative, spontaneous, and even give free expressions within the limited scope of whatever is available within that time.
Vast scope.
The Sharira was performed to different time scales and different performances.
Yes.
And see, I want to draw your attention to the statement that you always quote from Chandra, saying that where does the body end and where does the body begin? What is the philosophical import of that statement in relation to the pieces that you worked with Chandra and also your work?
I think this was a real question. I think at the core of her work, she saw the body as a very primal and central character, or
as the vehicle for larger questions about life. And I think that in the time that she worked, she felt there was a real need to revive this question. You know, she felt that as a society, we were perhaps all the time just caught up in the mundane. It was affecting bodies in certain ways. Everything was about speed and information, you know, capitalism, which you brought up recently. I mean, these things had already started then, let's not forget, sort of in the 80s, 90s, India. And I think that for her, this question, where does the body start and where does it end, had very much to do with her, a particular vision that she had for the body. And for her, the body was not something to be trivialized. It was at the very core of teaching us how to live as people, as better human beings. So, in a way, for me, this question of hers came from her own sort of certain kinds of political sort of investigations. But what was interesting for me was actually how this question translates into her work as performance. And I think that the question itself led her to create her entire theory about body and space came from this question, that the arm was never just reaching from the center of the spine to the tips of the fingers. It had to reach into eternity. So there was a certain extension of the body which actually became a tangible, sort of a technical thing, that when you worked with Chandra as a dancer, this was what you had to learn. You had to create endlessness out of your own body line. And you had to draw, like Sharira, for instance, the first half an hour of Sharira in the version that I was dancing, I was only sitting on the floor in one stationary position and only working with my arms in certain kind of gestural movement. But for the whole half an hour, I had to have a real sense of connecting myself to something that was far below me, that almost the visualization of my spine had to become an extension that came from the core of the earth and that extended infinitely. So it could sound vague in a moment, but after years and years of working with her, with hearing her say, this isn't charged, try something else, this is dead space, try something else, you realize that this work, you know, today people say, you know, what do you mean when you say space, space, space? What do you mean when you say charging space? But you only know when you really work at it. And I think that this idea of charging space, when I performed Sharira in Bombay at NCPA, famous German choreographer Sasha Waltz was in the last row, and you know it's a big auditorium. And she came to me after the performance, and she said to me, I could see every breath that you took. And that is what traveling through space becomes about. And I think that this work is something that I feel I could only carry forward in my own solo work, which is very limited because I have predominantly a body of group work, and I always found it very difficult to do that work which Chandra did with me on space. I found it difficult to do it with other dancers. But in my own solo work, for instance, if you look at the work of Beautiful Thing 2, it attaches itself completely again to this idea of moving space, and that's what Beautiful Thing 2 was about. You know, a series of the same movement in repetition, constantly only traversing one line, and I call it displacing space. And I think that for me that work is a direct extension of this technique of space, which I actually learned from my years working with Chandra, and especially from that experience of working Sharira with her. So I think that it's always, you know, as choreographers, we say lofty things sometimes. We all do that. But you can always call someone's bluff, because you're like, okay, you said this, but what is it actually, what is it becoming in terms of a choreographic trait, or what is it becoming in terms of movement? So I think for me, that's why I refer time and again, because often I see dancers today and I ask them, how do you see your body? You know, because if you don't have an image, if you don't have a visualization of what your own body is, then where does your own authentic idea of body and movement come from? And for me, without a dancer developing that, for me, they shouldn't be choreographers, because it's an important starting point, I think. It's not just about what movement should I do or all of that. Those are the secondary things. But what is this vision of body that you have for yourself? I think that's an important thing.
Let's talk about your practices then.
Okay.
The practices that you mentioned in distributing work to your group dancers and then provoking them to come out with movements, you divide the body into 3 sections: torso, legs, and other things. Is it not fragmenting the body?
Yeah, as a starting point.
Yeah.
But this piece of this was one particular work. It's not that I don't follow the same idea of task.
But homage to feet, for instance, the title gives away that you are particularly looking at one fragment of the body.
Yeah, that was a solo work. So I think the work to maybe start looking at is Paper Doll, because I think that until Paper Doll, in all of my works, including Fragility, I was following a more traditional choreographic methodology,
Right.
which is what I had learned from Chandra, which is you create a movement, you teach it to the dancers, you organize it in time and space, and that's the work. And I had a feeling at the point of Fragility that it was leading to a certain distance between the dancer and the action, because they were all the time trying to execute a movement which came from my body, which I had thought about and created, and was somehow more to do with my physical practice and aesthetic. So with Paper Doll, I thought, well, let's think about creating vocabulary that comes from a collective starting point, so that everybody feels a sense of inclusion and involvement, and that the actual creation of language can go beyond my own imagination. So with what I started to do with Paper Doll alone was, I created the divisions between body. I would ask different groups of dancers to create with very controlled parameters, because I always find dancers are very afraid when you give them too much freedom. They know absolutely not how to deal with that. So I always have created very clear parameters. So my parameter every day would be, give me 8 simple actions of the feet. Give me, to another group I would say, give me 8 simple actions of the head together with shoulders. And to the last set, give me 8 simple actions of the spine. And each group doesn't know what the other is actually creating. Doesn't matter. Then it was almost like, you know, when you have these puzzles as a child, you have these men with hats, t-shirts and shoes, and you can mix them all up. So it was a little bit like this. I think a lot of these ideas come also from these games. Then I would randomly say, okay, now we collect in random sequences. We put together your sequence of head with my sequence of feet and Krishna's sequences of spine actions. So you're actually creating a set of strange action that isn't controlled by intention so much, but has a random quality to it. So you immediately, we did this for almost a whole year. We created like a huge amount of material that all had the same strange connectivity of body part and coming together, and this became the starting point for the work. Once I had this is sort of the ABC, then I start to draw out. I say, well, this phrase is interesting, let me like lengthen it in time 10 times, let me apply certain other like questions to the material, and that's the way I developed the language for Paper Doll. And I enjoyed the process so much, and I felt that it helped dancers because there was always a movement that they had created that was somewhere. You know, so it didn't feel like this was a language that was mine, that I had imposed, but it felt like a language that everybody had shared. And with every piece, I tried to create a process that I would like. With Pushed, it was more a process of sharing your own experiences of emotional moments for yourself and deriving sort of the visual code for the language from the actual written material. So with every piece, I was very clear that it wouldn't just be me deciding I would do this movement or that, because after a point, this whole business of choosing movement became very meaningless for me. Why is one movement better than another? So my philosophy would be every movement is valid. What makes it work or not work is what context I place the movement within. And that became my work as a choreographer, and that's the work that I love to do. I love to play with structure. And it's in the structuring of the material that the work becomes created. So that was a process that I began with Paper Doll, and ever since then I've tried to actually create in a way that the process is somehow outside of myself, that I don't control too much, you know.
That is one thing I wanted to ask you about. When I watched your earlier performances prior to Fragility, something like Soliloquy, if I remember, there was a kind of a bewilderment in the whole sequence. There is an anxiety, there is a helplessness, there is a revenge.
But I was 26 at the time, so you can hardly blame me.
I know. I see that slowly that you are coming out of those, and then I see that kind of an emotions expressed quite explicitly in Pushed. But the rest of the other performances, I don't see the emotions expressed so explicitly. They are all very controlled, understated, even like doll-like expressions. Why the face to be out of the body in terms of expressing the emotions and everything?
Was there any face in Pushed?
Well, Pushed has quite a few very nice expressions, facial expressions, I would say.
But Pushed is a work about emotion.
Okay.
None of my other works explicitly look at emotion. I mean, the starting point with Pushed was because we were doing this research with Korea at the time, and all of the music for Pushed was created with traditional Korean musicians, and it was an interesting idea for me to look somewhere at something that connected the way Korean traditional music is organized with the way our own music and dance is organized. So this compartmentalization of emotion. And we have 9, they had 7.
Okay.
I decided after many years of completely trying to avoid an obvious looking at emotion, I decided I wanted to make this work again about emotion. For me, it's still a very abstract work. It's not a work that's about expressing emotion. It's about, it's a work for me that looks at what actually happens to the body in an emotional state. So it's two very different things. And I think every work for me is looking specifically at a conceptual idea. I mean, and if I were to restrict my whole exploration in terms of dance to one area, which was emotion, I think that would be quite limiting for me. It's not the most interesting thing for me. In fact, if you look at a work like Beautiful Thing 1, where I specifically say, I actually just want to create a beautiful thing that doesn't necessarily have to say something either politically or thematically, that it's just a work that's about sort of time, so the speeding up and slowing down of time. Then for me there's obviously no overt space for emotion, but for me the simple act of a human body on stage is an emotional act. And of course much of that, the quality of its expression is lost when one is watching on film, but I think that I've never been very interested in the idea of expressing emotion because I find it so limited by the individual. I try to look at the idea of, like we talked about, meaning being created out of movement, and I like to think about the idea of emotion as well being created out of a moment. And not necessarily, and I hate it when dancers, because it's too, I mean, you're having a bad day and then you want to create a solo which is full of angst, or you have sometimes you have very angry dancers who put these feelings into movement, and I find that very tiring and unnecessary.
The Beautiful Thing 1 and 2 were very brilliant too, but the other one, like Kolam, were you wandering into some other area which is not your own?
Yeah, absolutely. But it was an area that interested me. I mean, I have done a few projects which have been commissioned projects. So with Kolam, yes and no. There was a starting proposition, which is that, so there was a huge restriction on what the movement could be. So I didn't have to think about it. It had to be only walking. And there were many parameters which I think are not so interesting to talk about. But what interested me about Kolam was that what the audience is seeing is very pure, in that it's only about the way the piece is structured, that you're actually creating certain narrative of space and time, and that's all. And this has always interested me. Therefore, it was a work that there was a fun thing to do for a few months, but very also not layered. It couldn't go. So after that, in fact, somebody has asked me, would you be interested in developing it into a longer work? But I wasn't really interested because the fact that I could only play with this whole vertical action of walking meant that, okay, it was an interesting thing for me to do for those 10 minutes, but that was it. But I mean, I think it's wrong to see Kolam as a work on its own, as I said, in the way that it's always shown. It's always with 5 or 6 other similar ideas of carpets and people walking. And then you see a choreographic stamp when you look at Kolam, because that's what I could bring to it. Whereas all the other works of the French choreographer David Roland have very different ideas of time and space. I mean, there's no stillness in his work. There's no tension really between sound and what the dancers are doing. And I think that was what, I mean, the work also that Martin and I did together with Kolam was kind of interesting for us to do.
Was wall dancing your political piece? Overtly political?
I don't see it that way. Why do you say that? Why do you ask me
Because
that?
you wanted to break away from the center space and then wanted people to participate and come and go in any time of the
I think it
day.
was political
In
it was
making
addressing
it
a certain politic of performance. And I think it was addressing a politic of market or the way work in a visual. As I said to you earlier, in the previous work already, Beautiful Thing 2, I started to work with some curators from Bombay who had written to me at the time. They're called the Clark House Initiative. And it was interesting for me because all of a sudden, after so many years of only being in dance festivals, dance theatres, these visual art curators wrote to me and said, we want to do an exhibition with you. And over the years, even before I started working on wall dancing, I started to find it quite interesting to frame my work as visual art and not as performance. And I think it worked for me also because of the nature of my work. Often I think people had said to me that there was something about my work that had a more visual art frame to it, in that it remained proposition, that it often didn't go beyond the fact of proposition itself. There was often no narrative, it was very abstract, it has a sculptural sense to it, it engages very much with, all visual art kind of frameworks. So when I started to engage the visual art space, I found it quite freeing in a sense that there was a sense that work could remain quite raw, like there wasn't this whole drama of production, and I felt it quite nice that people could be, like there was the possibility of proximity, that it took me very close to this idea of letting go of kind of this notion of projecting off the stage, so people could be very simple with their bodies. So there were certain ideas that over the years, every time I performed Beautiful Thing 2 off the proscenium, in a simple setting with just some tube lights or gallery lights, with nothing around, with people just sitting around me, I started to really enjoy it as an experience. And so I thought, with wall dancing, why not, rather than making a work for a stage and taking it away from the stage, why not start by actually creating a work for a non-stage situation? And then I thought, people were always telling me, oh, the work is so slow, it's boring, I can't really sit through an hour. So I thought, okay, come and go as you want. So I was really responding to sort of 15 years of hearing how people were reacting to my work. And then I thought to myself, okay, you can't sit in my work for more than 10 minutes because you can't concentrate. So you have the freedom of coming and going. But for myself, I actually wanted to create a work that was much longer than an hour. Because I felt for myself that I had the possibility to create and structure much longer work. So it felt like a happy balance. I could create a 3-hour endless, slow and boring work, but the audience could choose. But ironically, what ended up happening was audiences were always coming at the beginning and sitting for 3 hours. So the purpose was defeated. They were still leaving saying it was slow and boring.
A nice interpretation and background information on wall dancing. I was curious about the absence of male dancers in your performance. That's why it's so, except in wall dancing, that you have.
One of the biggest struggles has been, despite living in a city which is filled with dancers, there are not many who are interested, be willing to do the kind of work that I do. And I've never had a practice of auditioning or putting out calls for dancers. I wait for dancers to sort of knock on my door. So somebody hears about me through some source, they write to me, I meet them. If it works out, they enter my practice. No matter like what quality of dance they come with, I'm willing to work and train, etc. And I think that the absence of male dancer is simply because male dancers haven't shown an interest to work with me, and perhaps because there's always been some kind of a subtext where people have referred to my work as it being about certain kind of ideas of the female body specifically, which maybe it has. Maybe the language I work with also is more specific to female body. It's something I've thought about from time to time.
And could you elaborate your work with musicians and music in general? How does it affect the compositions?
Yeah, I mean, most of my work is created and structured without music.
Without music?
Yes, I very rarely have started with a piece of music and said, okay, I'm now going to make a composition with this. So I have like a grid, which is a time-based grid, which is mostly quite a rhythmic grid, because that's sort of an understanding of time that I know very well. And so I always am creating without sound information, which makes it actually difficult for the people, the musicians that I work with. And most of my work has been created with one composer, Martin Visser. And I think that in the early work that we started to develop together, I saw it as a sort of a parallel research where I was very much looking at movement aesthetic. And my question to him was, how do we find a sound aesthetic that somehow matches and resonates and perhaps challenges what one is seeing? And I think that his own journey in creating multiple works with me has led him to also rethink what sound is and how to generate sound, and sort of been exploring just different ways to record, different ways of looking at pitch, frequency. So it's very much, I mean, you asked me a while back, what do I look at as research? But I think that his journey has also been, it's been a parallel research, I think, for both of us.